We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
Hello everyone, I'm Doshon Farad. Welcome to Your Black World. Today, June 28th, marks the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, founded by Malcolm X. Today we'll be speaking with two prominent scholars on Malcolm's and the organization's significance in the 21st century. Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Box Records and Friends of the African Union. Today, June 28th, marks the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, founded by Malcolm X. Today, to discuss the significance of the OAAU and Malcolm X's role in the Black liberation struggle, we have former Seton Hall professor and author of the book Civil Rights to Black Liberation, Malcolm X and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, Dr. William Sales. We also have with us the press officer for the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee, as well as the National Minister of Culture for the New Black Panther Party, Zaid Muhammad. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. First, I want to start with you, Dr. Sales. First, in the age of a black president, is the Organization of Afro-American Unity and Malcolm X still relevant?
I would say it certainly is for a number of reasons. First, the Organization of Afro-American Unity was an attempt to mobilize the race, whether it be present in its African form, Caribbean, North America, Europe, or wherever. It was the most recent of a continuous trend in the development of black people, right, to organize and to promote racial unity. If you look at the world today, if anything, black people internationally are in a chaotic state. To say they would be unorganized would be to minimize how bad it is. All right? So we still need principled racial unity. A second thing is that addressing this notion of the age of Obama, Malcolm was very clear that black leadership had to be accountable to the interests of black people. The yardstick was not merely skin color, the yardstick was accountability. From that perspective, the OAAU concept is still relevant because although there is a black man in the presidency is not accountable to black people. In fact, under this black president, more damage is being done to the notion of African unity than occurred under both Bushes, Bill Clinton, Eisenhower, anybody, Carter, anybody that you want to identify since World War II, since the era of colonialism. For just those two reasons alone, the OAAU is still relevant. I could give you more if you want me to continue, but that should be enough to get us going.
Well, just briefly, and of course we're going to get to Brother Zaid here. Now, when you say more damage has been done to African unity, please elaborate. Please give us a clearer answer of what that means.
Okay. Organizationally, the African Union superseded the OAU in the year 2000. The African Union is actually a weaker organization than OAU because it's not explicitly Pan-Africanist. It's an organization that was designed with the notion of better integrating Africa into this developing global economy. Right? It's not an organization based on Pan-African liberation. A second thing that we can say here, I would think, in terms of Africa, is that it has been penetrated more thoroughly by Western imperialism today than ever, even during the period of colonialism. The French are back in Africa with a vengeance, all right? The English are there, and above all, the Americans are all over the place, not only economically, but militarily. They have an Africa command. They have large bases everywhere. There's scarcely an African country that doesn't have a significant American military presence. And the last thing is that overwhelmingly the governments of the African continent are served by a leadership class which, strictly speaking, we call comprador leadership class, a class that's there to facilitate imperialist penetration. The generation that was epitomized by the formation of the Organization of African Unity, the generation that was in charge when Malcolm still trod the earth, they have been superseded by sellouts.
Now, before we get to Baba Zaid here, you wrote a book, as I introduced, From Civil Rights to Black Liberation, Malcolm X and the Organization of Afro-American Unity.
Yeah.
Why did Malcolm establish the OAU?
On the 20th of May, 1963, independent African nations established the Organization of African Unity, hopefully as a first step to continental integration under Nkrumah's rubric of scientific socialism. Malcolm goes to Africa in the spring of 1964 with the express goal of establishing an international personality for the struggle of African Americans in the Western Hemisphere to get official status with the Organization of African Unity. He comes back to create the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, as a hemispheric affiliate of the Organization of African Unity. That is the organizational way that struggling black people in the Western Hemisphere could relate to continental-wide integration of the motherland.
Yes, we have Baba Zaid, who's been waiting patiently. Baba Zaid, you being what many people refer to as a Malcolm scholar, what is your take on the OAAU 50 years later and Malcolm X? Is Malcolm still relevant to the black liberation struggle?
Well, but first, I absolutely agree with everything that Bill said, and I'll start from the very grassroots space that Malcolm enters our consciousness, certainly the consciousness of most black men. I've said for years that Malcolm's autobiography is a lifeline for black men in America, certainly black men in these streets and black men in these prisons. And then when we talk about Malcolm's legacy, we have to get past the limitations of his strong image, of his strong voice, and recognize that in the end that the man was an organizer. Right? That was the man who built the Nation of Islam, a vehicle by which black men cleaned themselves up. And when he left the Nation of Islam, he creates another organization, more of a mass-oriented kind, to move our struggle even further ahead than what he could do then. And if we look at building on what Bill said at the lack of disorganization of our people, not just here in the States, but globally, like he's talking about, the need for that kind of organization and other kinds of organization as well are absolutely important. And he was one of our supreme best examples of being a principled leader and organizer. So we have a yardstick by which we can measure, these renaissance and these wannabe leaders who come before us in the standards that he left with his practice, with his life, and the character of his organizing.
And we'll be right back with Dr. William Sales and Brother Zaid Muhammad, and you are watching Your Black World. Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Box Records and Friends of the African Union. Okay, and we're back still speaking with Dr. William Sales and Baba Zaid Muhammad on the 50th anniversary of the founding of Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity. Now, this is a question I wanted to ask. The notion has been that Malcolm was abandoning black nationalism towards the end of his life. And of course, the example that is often used was when he was in Algiers and he had spoke to the white African leader. And I believe Malcolm had said, the white African leader said, well, where do I fit in the struggle? I'm African, but I'm not black. How would either of you address that? Was Malcolm abandoning black nationalism towards the end of his life? Is that a true notion?
I think that Malcolm was developing a better understanding of the role of nationalism in the black radical tradition. I like to say that he was moving from a narrow conception of black nationalism to a broader conception of pan-African internationalism. So he wasn't repudiating practical lessons of black nationalism. He was developing a deeper understanding, which he felt not be encapsulated by the expression black nationalism, right? So he moves to a more explicitly Pan-African formulation.
Well, we wanted to know then, all right, how then would you address Malcolm's assessment of the white African leader that he was speaking with? Once again, when he said, where do I fit in the African liberation struggle? Well, would you be able to be clearer on what he meant by that in his autobiography? Because that's often used, oftentimes, many people, many critics or many observers will say that was Malcolm's way of abandoning, quote, being pro-black. He was becoming more integrationist.
No. So that's no. He's not abandoning pro-black. He's expanding black nationalism to revolutionary nationalism. That Algerian person was in the context of a revolutionary struggle and of a revolutionary time. And in Algeria, even though there are people who are light of hue in Africa, is in Africa. It was a North African country. So no, he wasn't discarding his national tradition. He was expanding his national tradition. And that's the thing that we have to see. Our nationalist tradition is not confined to what he was dealing with when he was in the Nation of Islam. That was the limitations of the Nation of Islam. He understood that he had to be broader in his application of what he was trying to do, because we were a part of a broader international struggle, and we had a very strategic role in that international struggle, so we need to be able to battle on all those fronts.
Also, it's important to recognize that the person who asked me the question, all right, was speaking from a frame of reference which itself in Africa was being questioned. Right. In other words, one of the big issues that the Casablanca group of Pan-Africanists, that is Nkrumah, Nasser, Touré, among others, was addressing was the notion of what is Africa, right? You'll notice Europeans like to talk about black Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, right? These Pan-Africanists were repudiating that expression and thinking in continental terms, that if you're on the African continent, you are an African. Now that runs up against Pan-Arab nationalism or the notion of the Middle East, you see? And so you have this debate inside of the Pan-African movement that brings forth a question like, well, I'm an Algerian. What do I do as a white man? Well, the first thing, hey, brother, from the Pan-African perspective, you're not defined as white. What's important for us is that you're an African. See? So Malcolm, a question like that forces Malcolm to think more, not so much of skin color, but of African origin, right? And the great family of African origin. And so he moves to Pan-African internationalism.
Now, the contemporary answer to that would be what we saw in Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, an Arab who asserted that he was an African, and who offered more to the African Union than all of the African states combined with the resources that he had, and used also the wealth of his nation to certainly bring up the living standards of his people in their nation. And that's, and to be sure, that's the reason why he's probably not here anymore. And then, of course, the takedown is a current takedown. It's a takedown of our times, and he was taken down by someone who our people claim to love, not looking at that person through the lens of class and the lens of ideology. So Malcolm is real important, just to appreciate that particular scenario that just went down on our watch.
Now, both of you were, while in college, were student activists. Okay, I want to ask you, Dr. Sales, and then we're going to ask Baba Zaid. How significant or how powerful was the impact of Malcolm on student activists during that time? You were inspired by Malcolm's words while you were undergrad. And
in my own case, I can remember the first time I heard Malcolm. It was in 1962 at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm sitting at this Ivy League school in this big auditorium, mostly white people. And this big, tall, red-hued brother comes in with about 10 bodyguards. And I never heard anybody in my life before that point give white people the kind of hell that he gave them. And it was all true. Right? So the first thing is Malcolm scared us. But it's important because he shocked us out of a complacency. He challenged you to get involved. You know what I mean? He began to awaken the notion that there's something called a black person, a black man, and you're supposed to be that, or if not, you're supposed to aspire to it. You see? And so that's my first encounter. And subsequently, I did in fact get involved in the struggle at Penn. Then I came up to Columbia for graduate school. And as part of our whole takeover, we had a big debate between two different segments of black people about which way forward. And I had to respond to one of the more Negro students on the campus about what black students should be doing. And I had to call upon Malcolm prolifically, you know what I mean, in terms of where we as students should be going. And you can still access that. That speech is in print. All we did was talk about Malcolm, walk around with two books, the autobiography, and the second book was Wretched of the Earth. And they were related, right? Because Malcolm was giving to black people here formulations which Fanon had developed for all of us around the whole question of the role of violence and social change and the psychological rehabilitation. So Malcolm was central. See, he was an organizer, but he was also a phenomenal thinker, all right, in terms of what black liberation would mean under late 20th century conditions.
Oh, did you care to add?
Oh, yeah. Well, see, first let me clarify something. In this discussion, he's the Baba because he's older than me, all right? And I came along some 10 years later. And I didn't get Malcolm in college. I got Malcolm on the, in the drug transaction. I got him the hard way. And it's him again being a lifeline that saved my life, that allowed me to get myself to a point where I could ultimately go to college. And when I got to college, of course, I went to school right in Newark, right at Rutgers, Newark, and there was a black organization of students, had some brothers who were all up under the influence of Amiri Baraka. And of course, Amiri Baraka will tell you up front that when it came for him to really get his line of march, that Malcolm was his leader. So Malcolm's influence in terms of what was the residuals of the black student organization, or black student movement of Bill's time, carried over. And whenever you see any significant motion of black students since Malcolm, it's always been defined by Malcolm's influence. It always has.
There's one important development in the 80s that had a tremendous impact on black students here, and that's what was going on in South Africa.
That's right.
All right? The struggle against apartheid, the way the students took leadership after Soweto and pushing that struggle forward, and how the hip-hop generation gravitated to that struggle, and developed imagery that one could see in the mass media among our young people, and they were looking for someone around whom they could mobilize to take that kind of energy and transform their realities.
That's right.
And that person was Malcolm.
That's right.
Right? And so you begin to see Malcolm injected into the hip-hop culture in the middle 80s, right? And by the 90s, right, he's the icon of a new generation of students who are struggling for liberation.
That's right. And there's a downside to that, of course. Because the other side saw this Pan-African consciousness of these students who were children of the 60s. Right? I was born in 61. Okay? So we faced in another wave of chemical warfare into our community that was unprecedented in its scale and its damage. Okay? We had the big heroin waves in the 50s and the 60s to try and cool out what was going on in the 60s. And here we get hit with cocaine and with crack, something that even went beyond what heroin was doing, and it created an unprecedented scale of violence and dependency that our community is yet to get itself straight from. So again, we come back to the lifeline. How do we clean ourselves up from this kind of thing? And to be sure, there is no other model, in my modest judgment, that can do and undo that kind of damage on a personal scale in someone's life. And that we need to look in broader terms, like what Tulu Shakur did with the party, bringing acupuncture in to try and get us off of addiction and whatnot, beyond what the nation was doing. We need those kind of Malcolm-inspired paradigms to save what's left of our community right now.
What you should also be aware of, take the war on drugs, right? What are the major beachheads of the war on drugs? Colombia, cocaine connection, right? What's the #1 supplier of heroin today in the world? Afghanistan, right? And what you find is that the so-called war against drugs actually creates pipelines and militarizes people who are producing that death which is going to be imported into our country. There's so many links. Even if you look at the Balkans, when NATO intervened in 1980, the so-called Kosovo thing, one of the major transshipment centers for dope coming out of Afghanistan was Kosovo, controlled by the Albanian mafia. And here we are bombing Serbia, right, supposedly, to benefit that area.
And we'll be right back after this commercial break, and you're watching Your Black World. Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Box Records and Friends of the African Union. Welcome back. We are still speaking with Dr. William Sells and Brother Zaid Muhammad. Now, going back 2 years ago, Dr. Manning Marable had put out a very controversial book on Malcolm called Malcolm X Reinvention, if I'm saying it correct. He said many
Life of Reinvention.
A life of reinvention. He had said he had made many controversial assertions that many black scholars had actually co-signed, such as Dr. Cornel West, Dr. Michael Everett Dyson. In fact, Dr. Dyson, I can remember on May 19th, they got into a debate with Amiri Baraka on the Amy Goodman show concerning Marable's book, which came out actually maybe 2 days after he had died.
Marable died on a Friday, and I think it was the 6th of April, the following Monday. He died on the King assassination celebration on the 4th, and I guess it would have been the 6th or the 7th his book appeared.
Okay, now, right after that, I should say maybe several months later, you had a group of scholars and activists that put out a rebuttal called A Lie of Reinvention.
Jared Ball and Todd Burroughs.
Addressing the assertions that and the reports that Dr. Marable made. What I'd like to know from you now, Dr. Sells, you're in academia, and I've said that I've noticed this since I was a teenager. It seems that many black scholars are very careful in how they interpret Dr. King, but are rather careless in how they interpret Malcolm. What do you think that is about? Or am I wrong to say that? It seems that they seem to be very careless with that.
Well, I wouldn't ascribe to all scholars.
That's why I said some, or
errors
many.
of Manning Marable. In fact, the very interesting thing about the scholarly response to Manning's book is how the overwhelming African American scholarly response is negative. And that when you line up people who have demonstrated authority on Malcolm X in the black scholarly community, you see that the #1 website creator, Abdul Al-Kalimat, BrotherMalcolm.net, is in writing severely critical of Manning's approach. When you look at the #1 nationalist academicians, like Mwalana Karenga, Haki Mathabuti, among others, they are in book-length print very critical of Manning, all right? When you look at the Black Scholar, it put out a special issue. I think it's number 41, number 2 of the Black Scholar, which devoted the entire issue to assessing Malcolm. In that issue, I had an article, Abdul Al-Khalid had an article, President of the National Council of Black Studies, at that time had an article, among others, and I would say on balance, the opinion there was critical, all right? The #1 documentary, I would say, Make It Plain, which was an important segment of Eyes on the Prize that dealt with Malcolm. Cheryl Green, the editor, along with Bill Strickland, they also are critical of Manning's approach. So in my mind, there's no question that the overwhelming bulk of scholarly opinion in our community was that Manning's book left a hell of a lot to be desired and in no way could be the standard by which one would either study or evaluate Malcolm.
Let me say something. That's the man that should have gotten that gig. This is the black scholar that came out of the battles of Columbia to move our struggle ahead, not using Malcolm as the paradigm. Okay, Manning was not a part of that. Manning was someone who's always, been available to the other side to soften, you know, key radical figures, and he's done it with other figures. But you know, no. We were all he's right on point. But and one of the things that was so maddening about Manning's book is that he's got a bibliography that lists all of the scholarship that came out of a profusion of reinterest in Malcolm that Bill Sales and Abdullah Kalima brought together in 2 years of symposiums called Malcolm X Speaks in the 90s. Nowhere in the body or the interpretation or whatever Manning did in that book reflects that strong wave of very powerful scholarship that came out.
So are you saying...
The scholars are supposed to build on that which has gone before now.
So you're saying that Dr. Marable was aware of the symposiums that you're saying he was aware of?
Oh, yes. The reason he could not have claimed not to be aware was that one of those symposiums, the first international symposium, occurred in Havana, Cuba.
That's right.
All right? And that symposium was so important that Fidel Castro, on African Liberation Day 1990, invited the participants to the Palace of the Revolution and met with us for the better part of 3 to 4 hours and feted that group. Followed up very rapidly that following November by a huge international conference. About 37 foreign countries as well as the numerous states were represented at Birmingham Community College, which was organized and had all the contemporary thinking on Malcolm at that particular point. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with the content or everybody's position at those two groupings. But what that says is that there was serious scholarly activity on Malcolm X as early as 1990.
Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Box Records and Friends of the African Union.
And then he mentions make it plain. He the work that Gil Noble, the late Gil Noble, has also done some very important, you know, award-winning quality work on Malcolm. And that didn't even make it in Manning's bibliography. So it was disgusting on so many fronts. And then when he gets into this whole salacious thing, that is just as it was salacious. It was not scholarly. It was not well done. It was in my modest judgment, in the end he was paid to try and take Malcolm down because they've been trying to figure out how to unseat the power of his written legacy for the longest, and they were hoping that would have done the job, and they failed.
You know what's so sad about this whole process? When I first went to Cuba, Manning was my roommate. We roomed together in Cuba. All right. When I wrote this book, if you look on the back of the book, there's a blurb from Manning Marable, right? And repeatedly we interacted with each other for the better part of, 20 years or more, right? And I'm not by myself. A whole bunch of scholars knew Manning. It's not like he was hiding somewhere, right? Now, given that reality, we're all wondering, where did this book come from? This doesn't reflect the existing written scholarship. It doesn't reflect our interaction with him, all right? His editor, Cheryl Green, in this whole process, she resigned when she saw that what he was writing was not what was being sent to him by his various editors, that he had hired to kind of sift through this material.
And saluted for that, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to do, what I want to do is I want to take this time, as we're running out of time, of course, so before we go to our final segment. And this is somewhat of a sidetrack, I would say. Please describe the women that were in Malcolm's life. We understand that women had played a tremendous role in his life from the time he was coming up, while he was the national spokesman for the Nation of Islam and the development of Oaau. Dr. Sells, please describe that, and then we want to hear, of course, from my brother Zaid, his perception.
You got to go all the way back to his mother, Louise Little, who was a member of the Garvey movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and she was a corresponding secretary for the various Midwestern chapters headed by his father. In fact, Louise Little met Earl Little at a UNIA conference in Montreal, Canada, right, around the end of World War I, and they got married, right? she would send reports back to Garvey headquarters about the activities of the organization. So not only was his father, but his mother was a Pan-Africanist, all right? And then when he lost that family, both parents, right? His mother to mental illness and his father to a Klan-style murder, he was taken in by Ella Collins, his sister, all right? Who was a hardcore Garveyite and nationalist and tutored him in that, okay? When he decides that the Nation of Islam is not enough for him in terms of intellectual activist growth, and he goes to Africa, right? When he gets to Ghana, there are a number of black women already there who facilitate his access, not only to Ghanaian leadership, but to the international community there. One was Alice Wyndham out of St. Louis. Maya Angelou, everybody knows, and these people worked together. And another was Vicky Garvin, an old-line African-American socialist, a brilliant economist who had spent a number of years in Ghana and in China, all right? And they were very important in directing him to the type people who would help him develop a clear conception of what this Pan-African internationalism was all about. I think I mentioned a few, and I know that there were so many that I probably left a number of people out in terms of that development. But Malcolm himself always talked about the fact that he was evolving his position on women, given what he saw the role of women in the anti-colonial struggle in Africa. Right? And we see that in the OAAU. Lynn Shiflett was left in charge of the OAAU when Malcolm went to Africa in the summer of 1964 after the formation of the OAAU. She worked closely with Muriel Fieldings, the wife of Tom Fieldings, the artist, in keeping the OAAU motion alive. And I'm sorry, I'm just having a senior moment, but his secretary, he had a very young sister, Sister Sarah, all right, who was also crucial in keeping the OAAU alive. So you see women all over the place. And the person who's now documented this, for those who want to look at it further, is Rosemary Neal, who's done some good work on Malcolm.
And like many went to the Black Panther Party, inspired by Malcolm, yes.
You're watching Your Black World, and we'll be right back right after this for our final segment. Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Box Records and Friends of the African Union. Welcome back. Still joining us for our final segment is Dr. William Sales and Brother Zaid Muhammad. Now, before we go, I wanted to address something concerning Malcolm's impact as we've been discussing. Oftentimes people will say that, well, Malcolm was a bad person when he was in the Nation of Islam. He came back from Mecca, saw that they were white Muslims, and he accepted universal brotherhood. He's now a good person. All of a sudden, Malcolm is now a civil rights leader. I want to know, was Malcolm's time, or was Malcolm's activism as a minister in the Nation of Islam also as valid as his time when he left the Nation of Islam and became a Pan-Africanist?
Who do you want to respond first?
Well, actually, I'd like to hear from you, actually.
All of his work was valid. His conceptualization and his framework grew when he left the nation. And it's something that me and Khalid used to argue about, because Khalid tried to use the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's teaching in its most radical form, the way Malcolm did.
Speaking about Khalid Abdul Muhammad.
That's right. But all of it was valid. You know, I mean, Malcolm, so many lives were changed forever with the development of the Nation of Islam as a consequence of Malcolm's organizing and what he was projecting. And that projection laid the basis for what would explode in the revolutionary development of the movement in the 1960s. He was the fountainhead of all of that. So it was all, and to say that is a part of the revisionism that we have been fighting against for the last 25 years or so, since they've been trying to take down the revolutionary edge of Malcolm's legacy.
When we say past 25 years, you mean with the creation or the releasing of Spike Lee's movie? That was
a key part of the concern of a lot of us you know, who are of this orientation. That Hollywood and the interests of Hollywood are not the same as Malcolm's interest in commitment to our struggle and our broader commitment to our struggle. Hollywood's interest is to make money, to sterilize that and control it, and that's a propaganda. That's the propaganda machine for the imperialism that we were trying to organize ourselves out of and against, following Malcolm's line.
You wanted to add, Dr. Sales?
What Malcolm got from the Nation of Islam is a particular variant of our nationalist tradition, black religious nationalism, which exists as a critique, right, of Christianity and of, you know, of the oppressive nature of the society as a whole, right? He got that in his childhood from his Garveyite parents, and then there was this interruption, right, this hiatus, right? And he's returned to that tradition through his membership in the Nation of Islam and his tutelage at the head of Elijah Muhammad, right? He was developing very rapidly politically in the early 60s, much more rapidly than the other leadership in the nation, all right? And therefore, his energy couldn't be encapsulated in the motion of the nation. That's what he meant by, I can do better by stepping outside of the nation, right? He recognized the legacy that had been passed on him through the nation and felt he had to take it somewhere else. And if the nation at that point wasn't prepared to go there, he felt, I can do this work much better outside of the nation. And so it's not this notion of he was a bad man in the nation, right, and he became a good man when he came out of the nation, right? The truth of the matter, he was a dangerous man from their perspective when he was in the nation, right, and when he came out, he was really dangerous.
Okay, well this is another point that I've often asked. You know, Dr. Sales, you were a college student in the 60s.
That's right.
You said you saw Malcolm in 1962.
Yes.
At the height when he's calling
in
white,
the nation.
At the height when he was calling white people devils, okay?
In a way like no one has ever done before.
But this is what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
When he was calling white people devils, why was he being invited to speak at so many white Ivy League colleges by white students? Because recently, 2 years ago, there was an old newspaper clipping of Malcolm speaking at a school in Rhode Island in 1962. Why was he being invited at the time to address them when they knew how he was at that time?
One thing about higher education is that people want to expose students to diverse positions. Or students who believe in higher education want to be exposed to that kind of diversity. The second thing is that Malcolm had a tremendous impact on anybody who heard him, regardless of what color they were. He was so honest. When I first saw Malcolm, there was an African-American girl in the audience and a question and answer. She got up and questioned him about his severe attitudes towards white people. Malcolm looked back at the young lady and said, I bet you I know what color your boyfriend is. All she could do was sit down. Now Malcolm had not had any contact with that girl before, but he knew something about her and was prepared to call it right up in this big, huge auditorium, right? And people liked that about Malcolm. Whether they agree with him or they liked the fact that he was going to tell it like it was, right?
No matter what.
And so it was extremely popular, right? And the whole 60s generation later on becomes characterized by at least trying to tell it like it was. You see? Black, white, whatever color, women, men, you know, everybody's seeking that authenticity, be honest, you know, to break out of that 1950s tinsel nonsense that had developed in the Eisenhower years after World War II. And that's why he had that kind of power.
Well, I have to bring it forward because you and I had Khalid Abdul-Muhammad. We had Khalid Abdul-Muhammad, and Khalid had to leave the nation under very similar circumstances. Khalid had a very similar edge. Khalid had a very similar focus, you know. And when it was Khalid who brought his organizing finesse that he used for Minister Farrakhan to rebuild the Nation of Islam to really make the new Black Panther Party a truly national organization. Khalid came into the new Black Panther Party in Dallas and Houston, some members in Houston and Atlanta, New Orleans and Atlanta. When he got through, when he left here in 2001, we had 35 chapters, and those were young people. Those were young people. Those kids of the '90s, right? Who didn't have Malcolm, but who had somebody like Khaled that had helped them make sense of Malcolm in a way that was important to their generation.
Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Box Records and Friends of the African Union. Would you please describe briefly, if you would, Malcolm's relationship with Fidel Castro?
Malcolm, of course, came into contact with Fidel when Fidel first came to the United States and needed housing, and Malcolm facilitated his being housed at the Hotel Teresa. They had a very famous meeting. Over the years, Malcolm recognized that Cuba was a legitimate revolutionary center that was seriously dealing with the legacy of racism from the colonial period and had an excellent record of international solidarity.
And this was pre-Mecca Malcolm.
That's right.
Yeah, right?
That's right.
And he had contacts with Cubans through Robert Williams, through people like Barack and John Henry Clark from that Fair Play for Cuba committee in that early 1961 trip to Cuba. Muhammad Ahmed also maintained contacts with the Cubans for Malcolm. So Malcolm, and when he gets to Africa, one of the important people that he meets in Ghana through the good offices of Vicky Garvin and Maya Angelou and Alice Wyndham is the Cuban ambassador in Ghana. All these things explain why Malcolm has such a close affinity for the Cuban Revolution and for Fidel Castro.
I go even further. One of the things that Rosemary brought out in their historic meeting in Harlem is that, when they dialogue, they talk intimately for quite some time about each other and what they were doing and how they were more mobilizing our people. Malcolm was not first confronted with the limitations of the teaching of the Nation of Islam when he went abroad. Fidel and Che actually, as a matter of record, laughed at him when he laid out, the Yaqub history and all of that and whatnot. And I'm sure someone of Malcolm's, intellectual vigor and stature, he had to deal with that. So the seeds were already, so Cuba was very important in the development of his revolutionary internationalism, his emerging Pan-Africanism in that broad scale, because he was confronted with that limitation in a first-hand way by revolutionaries who came to him with the credentials that all revolutionaries needed to have that he was trying to bring us to.
Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Box Records and Friends of the African Union. Before we had left for our commercial, you were discussing some international things. You were discussing America's foreign policy. We now have, for the first time in history, the first undisputed African-American president, Barack Obama. Based on the writings and speeches of Malcolm X, would he be pleased with President Obama? Because many people, many African-Americans constantly say that he's in the same tradition as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and our other leaders. Would Malcolm be pleased with this president?
I don't think Malcolm would be pleased at all with Barack Obama. He wouldn't be pleased with Barack Obama because if we look at the domestic situation, Barack Obama has never acknowledged the peoplehood of African Americans. He runs from any explicit program for black people as a people. I think Malcolm would be horrified by that because Malcolm's politics focused on the notion of an autonomous community of people of African descent domestically who should control their own communities and have resources, political and economic, to do so. Obama in no way has fostered or promoted that kind of autonomous development among black people. Internationally, Malcolm said the enemies of African people were organized in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is the military form that imperialism takes. That's the international characteristics of the opponents of black liberation. And therefore, they're the number one danger to Africa. However, today we see that the leader of an expanded NATO is none other than Barack Obama. And what has he done as a leader of NATO? He's extended NATO's military arm into Africa. He's destroyed the most effective and probably the most progressive Pan-Africanist leader of the generation in the former leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. And in other parts of the world, he has, as some people said, been Bush on steroids. That is, if you look at the policies of the previous Republican administrations, with George Bush as the titular head, and with Dick Cheney as the man behind the scenes, the power behind the throne, that all those policies that one identifies with Bush internationally have been deepened and accelerated in the two administrations of Barack Obama. And they've been against the freedom of the planet. So I think both domestically and internationally, Malcolm would be very much opposed to Barack Obama.
You wanted to add to that,
Well,
brother?
I would definitely agree to that. I'll bring it back domestically. As President of the United States, is also over the Justice Department. It's the Justice Department that ultimately was the arm that the government used to stop the terrorism that our people lived under in the Jim Crow order with the Klan and that kind of terrorism. Justice Department should also be used, in my modest judgment, to rein in the extreme, violent terror that our people face from the police. Be sure we look at, I can go down the list. Troy Davis, right? Young man who was executed on the Obama's watch. There could have been a Justice Department intervention in that case to save that brother's life. Brother did nothing. Brother did nothing. Okay, we've got this train of the Malcolm X grassroots movement did a study on police brutality that came to the conclusion that every 36 hours, a person of color in this country, majority African, is killed or beaten by the police. Every 36 hours. That's not in the 1950s. This is on our watch under this president. His Justice Department has done nothing around that whole question. Even Bill Clinton, for all of his limitations and his hypocrisy and his fraud show that he put on black people, when James Byrd was lynched in Jasper, Texas, and Khalid Abdul Muhammad rolled into Jasper, Texas with the new Black Panther Party to confront the Klan, the federal government moved in and made sure those boys were prosecuted to stand off something going down of an armed kind between both sides. Did Barack Obama do the same thing when Alfred Wright was lynched in Hemphill, Texas just a little while ago when we stepped to the Klan again? His Justice Department has done nothing. And then the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act is gutted right in front of our face. He's, oh, it's a terrible thing. We need to do something with legislation. Where's your Justice Department and where's your spine, man? This is what got your behind here. So no, some of us have some serious problems with this guy on this front and are not willing to bite our tongue whatsoever with him. He was to be sure, he was the perfect cover for the expansion of the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine was regime change, right? He takes it to another level. Bush probably wouldn't have gotten away with some of the things that Obama did because Obama is black. He's a perfect cover for the end game of imperialism controlling Africa like it's never has before.
Now that's what I wanted to ask now concerning Africa. Is it true that under President Obama, AFRICOM has been expanded?
It has, very definitely.
In what way?
Several ways. One, it now has an actual footing, physical footing, headquarters footing in Africa. There are these huge bases that are being developed. The first one is right outside of the main capital in Djibouti. All right? It has expanded its presence in the sub-Saharan region of Mali and Chad and what have you. It has a drone base there. at least one. It has relationships with Rwanda, military relations with Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria. We can go through the continent. Probably Zimbabwe may be the only country where there's no extensive U.S. military relationship. So there are more boots on the ground, and these are special operations boots. Now, who are these special operations units? They're nothing but assassins, all right? They're hitmen, all right? They either direct drones and do the intelligence that directs drones, or they go in directly and shoot people. Not only do they shoot the people they're targeted to shoot, they shoot anybody else who happens to get in the way, all right? So Africa is occupied now more than it has been at any time since the end of former colonialism.
Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Fox Records and Friends of the African Union. Well, Dr. Bill Sells, Brother Zaid Muhammad, we thank you for joining us for a very lively discussion on this day, the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And we thank you for tuning in to Your Black World. I'm Doshon Farad. You can follow us on Twitter at Your Black World. You can follow me on Twitter at Doshon Farad. And also we have a Facebook page, Your Black World. Please like us if you can. We thank you for joining us. See you next time. Your Black World is being brought to you by Black Fox Records and Friends of the African Union.